Well, I'm very excited to welcome the great Karl Rove to our Leader and Authors series. Karl is a longtime friend of the firm and a beloved member of the Melman family extended. He's an accomplished historian, political savant, senior advisor to a president. Welcome, old friend.
Thank you, buddy. Appreciate it.
So, William McKinley is super hot right now. President Trump's name checking him in the inaugural address. All the media, The Economist, New York Times, Washington Post are revisiting his legacy. And you literally wrote the book. And even more, you wrote the book that came out in the summer of 2016. Realistically, you were doing this before Trump was meaningfully in the national political dialogue. I get you're a prescient, you're a trend spotter, but this had to be other reasons. Why McKinley? How long have you been following him? How long have you had this book on the brain, and what inspired you to write it?
Well, it's a weird tale. I was 44 years old and I was teaching at the University of Texas at Austin. And the head of the government department, Jim Fishkin, who's now out at Stanford, said, "We'll fast track you on the PhD, but there's just one problem. You got to get your BA." So at the age of 44, I'd not had my college degree. I see you got Roman Bueller here. Roman and I were active in college Republicans together. The difference is he got his degree, his I didn't. But anyway, so I
You
took
pulled
the
a Steve. You pulled a Bill Gates.
yeah, well, exactly. So I took the astronomy course by exam. I did a geology course. My dad was a geologist, but I had to fulfill the upper division writing requirement because there was no evidence after running a public affairs firm for about 16, 17 years that I could string together two sentences. So I checked through the catalog. It's a little bit busy because my principal client, the governor of Texas, was thinking about running for president. So I was busy and didn't want to take another class. So I found a History 355 in the course catalog, seminar and historical source writing. Do research in the original material, the original source documents, not secondary material, and write a paper and get 3 hours. And I thought this is great. I had no idea it was never done. It was just a placeholder. And when I walked into the history department and said to the secretary behind the desk that I wanted to take it, she literally laughed at me and said, "Nobody ever signs up to take you on." And I said, "Well, can I try? Is there a professor here?" And she said, "Well, there's only one professor in today. It was during the summer, Lewis L. Gould." And I had no idea who he was. And but she went in and said, "Would you see Mr. Rove?" He was willing to see me because he vaguely knew who I was. But I had no idea who he was. And he said, "What are you interested in reading and writing about, researching and writing about?" And I said, "I'm interested in Theodore Roosevelt, 1895 and 1896. He's at the bottom of his career. He has lost the race for mayor of New York. He's come in third. The boss of the New York Republican Party, the easy boss, Senator Thomas Collier Platt, hates him and will make certain that he is never slated as a Republican candidate for anything. The only way that he can resurrect his career is to sign on with a presidential campaign and hope that his candidate wins and appoints him to a federal post and he can return to Washington." And he signs up with a front runner, Thomas Brackett Reed, Speaker of the House, and writes influential articles on his behalf and talks among his friends in New York and helps to organize the campaign. And Reed loses to the outsider, the reformer, William McKinley. And 2 or 3 days after the Republican convention in St. Louis, Roosevelt writes one of his favorite correspondents, his sister Bammy, and says, "We had a great convention in St. Louis with a magnificent gold plank, but, quote, McKinley is a good man, but he is weak, and I worry about him in a moment of crisis for our country." And 2 days later, he writes a letter to one of McKinley's closest personal friends and says, "We must do everything we can to elect McKinley. And when he's elected, you must be the minister to France, or at least the secretary of the Treasury. And my ambitions, such as they are, can go by the wayside," which is his way of saying, "God, man, I need you, man. I need some help." And he spends the next 3 or 4 months weaseling his way into the middle of the McKinley campaign and resurrects his political career because at the end of the campaign, the guy to whom he writes the letter saying, "My ambitions can go by the wayside," is one of McKinley's closest personal friends. And more importantly, his wife is really smart. And they go to McKinley and say, "He's done good work for you. He wants a job in Washington. It's not even in the cabinet. It's the number 2 at the Navy Department, a newly created post. why don't you give him that job? He's your kind of guy. He's a reform-minded outsider. He's a young man with enormous abilities. Why don't you pick him for the Assistant Secretary of the Navy? And McKinley says, I'll consider it, but quote, I do not trust your young man Roosevelt. He's too pugnacious. So I was interested in how did Roosevelt go about resurrecting his political career? And unbeknownst to me, I am sitting in front of one of the greatest historians of the Gilded Age, Professor Lewis Gould, who says to me, I've never done this, but I will take you on as long as you make one commitment to me. You will read the McKinley papers because history gets McKinley wrong. And the more that I read in the McKinley papers, which are disorganized mass of things that are held at the Library of Congress and are available at the University of Texas Library, which is a sub-depository, the more I became convinced this guy is really something. He is smart, he's kind-hearted, he's respected, he's thoughtful. And the more I looked into his personal background, I was blown away by how he rose. He comes from a modest family in Northeast Ohio, an abolitionist-minded family. He enlists in the United States Army at the age of 18 in the spring of 1861 and emerges from the Civil War 4 years later as a major, having survived 3 battlefield suicide missions, 2 of which he launches himself on. And anyway, the more I read about him, the more interested I was. I'd studied the election of 1896. In fact, one of the great political scientists of realignment theory taught at the University of Texas. But we look at the election of 1800 as Jefferson versus Adams, and the Republicans versus the Federalists, and 1828 the rise of Andrew Jackson and the emergence of the Democratic Party, and 1860 Abraham Lincoln and the coming of the war, and 1932 FDR confronting the Great Depression. But 1896, we don't pay attention particularly to McKinley. We look at it as a contest of gigantic forces, urbanism and agrarianism and growing industrialization and America merging into the modern economy. And in reality, it's a fantastic story of 2 gigantically different people who are amazing in how they perform, the Democratic nominee and the Republican nominee. And the guy who I come out respecting the most is the guy who changed American politics for the good, broke the stalemate of the Gilded Age, and ushered in a 32-year period of Republican dominance that is only interrupted when Republicans fight among themselves. And it's all this genial, thoughtful, kind-hearted, well-respected outsider, a reformer named William McKinley.
This must not be the first discussion of your book that you've had since 2016. That was comprehensive and awesome, and it makes me want to reread the book. I read it when it came out because you're Karl, and I'm a history nut, and I love this stuff, and I loved it back then.
And Amy would have spoken sharply to you had you not read the book.
And she
Amy,
would indeed. And I would note for the regulars who attend our events, there was so much interest in this. We ended up buying 175 copies of this book. We'll send a link around. At some point we run out, but Amazon does not, which is good. So the current president, 47, loves 25. And, part of it, he sees a lot of similarities. And look, both were Republicans who pushed for tariffs on behalf of manufacturing. Both got shot. Both nearly faced personal bankruptcies. Both showed signs of being imperialists. I always wonder, I'm interested in whether McKinley was as much an outsider as Trump, because I look at the guy and I think from 21st century, he's decorated war hero, spent 7 terms in the House, rising to the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, 2 terms as governor. That's a pretty darn establishment resume by modern considerations. He wasn't the populist in the race. William Jennings Bryan was the populist in the race. This huge question: are he and Trump more similar or more different? What is the experts' take?
Yeah, more different. The reason I say that McKinley was an outsider was that McKinley was not part of what was called the Combine. That's the loose affiliation of the Republican bosses who made decisions about who had the best shot at winning and then backed that individual in return for considerations. If you were the New York Republican boss, you wanted to make certain that you had control of the New York port collector's job because that had not only hundreds of patronage jobs, but it was an enormously, financially rewarding place to have. I mean, everybody there had to donate part of their salary to the Republican machine. And McKinley was a reformer. He was an outsider in the sense of he was not part of the bosses. In fact, his slogan in the 1895, 1896, we would call it a primary season, but in the fight for the nomination, his slogan was "the people against the bosses." And so, in that sense, he was an outsider. But no, McKinley was an institutionalist. He was a widely respected member of Congress. You may not know this about the Gilded Age, but in the Gilded Age, starting in 1874 and running through 1904, it was routine during that 30-year period for the majority party in the House of Representatives to phony up a challenge to a member of the minority that had won re-election by a small number of votes and kick them out. This happened 56 times during this 30-year period. 15 Congresses, so it's about, they're doing better than 3 of these a session in order to kick out, grow their majority. And in 1882, McKinley wins re-election by a handful of votes. No evidence whatsoever in his swing Ohio district that it was stolen, but the Democrats who are in the majority in the House phony up a challenge, and in early 1884, they eject him from the House of Representatives. And the only unusual thing about it is that leading Democrats vote to retain him in the House, which is a mark of the respect that the man had across party lines. So no, he was very different in manner than Trump, and also different, frankly, in on the 2 issues that you raised. Let me take one of them quickly. He was not an imperialist. For example, he was the chairman of the Republican Platform Committee in 1884, and it endorsed independence for Cuba. Not that Cuba, having been freed from Spanish rule, would become a colony of the United States, but independence. And when the Spanish War was forced upon him, and we came into the possession of like the Philippines, his attitude was, how quickly can we bring them to a state of self-governance? Cuba immediately, because the institutions and the people already existed there, but Philippines needed to be pacified first and organized so that it could take on governing itself. So he came into possession of great swaths of territory as a result of the Spanish-American War, but he was not an imperialist in the sense of he was saying, okay, let's go get Greenland and let's retake the Panama Canal, and Canada shall be our 51st and 52nd state. That would have been anathema to the major. But the biggest difference is on the question of tariffs. And I tried to write a column last week about it for the Journal.
You succeeded. I read it.
Yeah, well, thank you. I can now die a happy man. But the interesting thing to me is that Trump gets McKinley so wrong in this regard. First of all, America was a much different place. The federal government's share of the GDP was 3%. Last year it was 24%. We had no direct taxation. We had no income tax. It had been declared unconstitutional and doesn't appear until the 16th Amendment in 1913. And our revenue was primarily excise taxes on liquor and tobacco and tariffs. We'd gotten a significant slug of money from land sales earlier, but about 90% of the income of the federal government is coming from these 2 sources. So you're talking about the tariffs being about 1.5% of GDP. That is much different than today, when the federal government takes up 24% of the economy, and where the largest source of income are individual and corporate taxes. And tariffs are, ironically enough, about 1.5% of our total revenue, not of the economy, but of our total revenue. So a much different situation. And McKinley was not a willy-nilly high tariff man. He was a moderate tariff man. He was focused on adjusting the tariffs based on how much revenue the federal government objectively needed. He was not just sort of whatever you want you get. In fact, when people would come before the Ways and Means Committee, he would say, "Don't tell me what you want, tell me what you need." And he was willing to not have tariffs on things that Americans weren't good at, like tobacco. Let's not have, we're not that good on tobacco any longer. The coffee we can't raise here, and yet the working man depends on coffee. Sugar, there aren't enough cane growers in Louisiana There's no sugar industry in Florida. The Van Huel brothers had yet to show up. But his attitude was we need to have low tariffs or no tariffs on things that people needed for their everyday existence. If we couldn't produce it here, we shouldn't have it. And by the time he became president, he really had become a reciprocal tariff man. He had become to realize that all these giant enterprises growing in America, John Deere, International Harvester, Singer Sewing Machine, these were companies that could prosper only if they had foreign markets. And he looked at the bounty of American agriculture and said, we can feed the world. And so he became the advocate of reciprocity. If you'll lower your tariffs, we'll lower ours. And he's the first president to appoint a trade representative, John Kaysen of Iowa, a respected diplomat and former congressman. And Kaysen goes out, and I think it's 9 treaties that he agrees that he gets agreement on, and all of them are in McKinley's first term stymied and stalled and ignored by the U.S. Senate, which is where the high protectionist Republicans had their sway. So a much different situation than today, and a much different economy, and a much different attitude about tariffs themselves.
So I want to take on both tariffs and the imperialist stuff. First on imperialism, you're right about the Philippines. However, Spanish-American War, we annexed Hawaii, it's a state. We annexed Puerto Rico, still a protectorate. We annexed Guam. Feels pretty imperialistic given that 100 and however many years later we haven't given them back and don't intend to. I'm not trying to defend the current president's comments on Greenland or Canada, though one gets the sense they're more about trying to take maximalist opening positions on getting what he wants in terms of mineral rights or access, defense bases and such. For McKinley, we're still holding several of those. What was the motivation on Hawaii and Puerto Rico and Guam, and why do we still have them?
Well, on Guam, it was a fueling station for American trade and more importantly, the American Navy. So he was looking at it from a trade perspective. How can we guarantee that if we are sending trading vessels around the world, that our Navy, our growing Navy, can refuel? And so he cut a deal to hold on to Guam came to us as a result of the Spanish-American War, and it was it was not a very big population, but it had strategic impact to trade. Hawaii is a different deal. Hawaii came to us because driven primarily by an American-born American-born class of plantation owners, but also Native Hawaiian views. Hawaii was afraid of being taken if they were not annexed to the United States. They feared they might be taken over by the Japanese. There were an increasing number of Japanese that were working the fields. Japan was getting aggressive. They had just beaten they had just taken on in China. They were at war. They were not yet at war, but they were at odds with the Russians. They were a growing military power, naval power, and as a result, Hawaii was afraid if we don't ally ourselves with a bigger, friendlier country, the United States, we're going to be taken over by the Japanese. And look, I think Puerto Rico was one where he actually thought, and he only had Puerto Rico for like 3 years. And remember, he wins the war in 1898 and he's dead by 1901. I think his attitude was, again, how do we get them to self-governance? And it was after him that the United States began this Commonwealth relationship, and 40 years later, that has kept them in alliance with the United States. But again, his mindset was not, geez, we're going to be an imperialist power. It was, we need a little dot out in the Pacific there where we can refuel at. Hawaii makes sense because it's head west from California, and the next land you might run into is Hawaii. And we don't want the Japanese to be on our doorstep. But he's not looking around for countries to acquire.
All right, how about on tariffs? You're right. It used to be revenue. It's in Trump's case also reshoring, and reciprocity is kind of his new where he seems to be eager to take things going forward. And certainly revenue and reciprocity, as you made the point, were McKinley rationales for protectionism.
Yeah.
The present sure seems to echo. I mean, you're right. You have an institutionalist in McKinley, an anti-institutionalist in Trump, a someone whose choice of words and style were charming and calm versus someone who arguably in the social media environment plays for maximum impact. But it seems like both, at least two of the three, are attempting to accomplish revenue and reshore and reciprocity. It feels fairly similar, minus the evolution that you saw from McKinley hasn't yet uh, shown itself with Trump.
Well, I'd say two things. First of all, let's take the revenue issue. There's a big difference between saying that in an environment in which, basically 3% of the GDP is devoted to the federal government, that tariffs are important for a revenue. In a situation where the federal government is 24% of GDP, and again saying this is going to be an enormous source of revenue for us. Think about this. We had $3 trillion plus of imports last year. Our how much we have a 6.6 billion or $6 trillion plus budget. So how can you get a lot of revenue out of let's say you got a 10% tax on everything that comes in. That's assuming that everybody continues to buy the same amount of whatever French wine, blah 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 blah. That's $300 billion. Which is a drop in the bucket in comparison to a $6 trillion uh, and that assumes that there's no trouble with your economy by raising taxes on imports. That nobody's going to retaliate by raising their tariffs on American goods and services coming into their country. There is a comparative advantage. We're better at doing. Boeing airplanes are flying all around the world, and Mexican avocados are coming up from the south for our Super Bowl celebrations. And that's the comparative advantage. So they aren't exactly the same. The second thing is, remember, McKinley was using reciprocity as a tool to reduce the barriers abroad, primarily back then tariffs, though there were some non-tariff barriers, more non-tariff barriers today. But he was attempting to do that in order to open markets for America. I hope that becomes the Trump view of what reciprocity consists of. But I think it's more likely that it is, we're going to raise tariffs on you in order to get you to agree to buy more goods from us, like we did with the Chinese. Remember, in the first term, that was the whole deal behind we're going to raise tariffs on China, and in turn, you're going to buy, soybeans from North Dakota. Well, we raised the tariffs. And then they agreed to buy the soybeans, so we took down some of the tariffs, and they never bought the beans. Go talk to the people in North Dakota about how they feel about that deal. And
Yeah.
we ended up having to take billions of dollars out of the federal treasury in order to reimburse those farmers. So again, I don't think maybe it's an accident, but my story about reciprocity went up on the Wall Street Journal page on Wednesday night a week ago, and on Thursday, Trump says we're gonna have reciprocity so soon. It's gonna be wonderful. And I know he doesn't read much, but I know he occasionally hears about my column because if I say something that he doesn't like, I generally hear about it through intermediaries.
No, that's true. Oh, by the way, I didn't realize you're quite good at impressions. So far, we got Teddy, we got Trump. Maybe so it's like Chat GPT. Give your next answer in George W. Bush's voice. One thing
Okay,
I'm interested in is
I'd like to do it. What's your question there, Brucey? What's your question?
so was the congressional GOP in the McKinley era? Did they get as thoroughly tamed and become as subservient to President McKinley as the 2025 congressional GOP has become for Donald Trump? Because when I haven't been able to get the bandwidth to put my report together, but when I think about the contrasts between 2017 and 2025, which is what I want to make my slide deck for Q1 about, one of the single biggest factors is this MAGA ecosystem that's engaged and that is absolutely terrifying the Hill GOP, such that a lot of senators are voting to confirm people who, in a secret ballot, they would never vote to confirm. And a lot of folks are really worried about stepping out of line. And I don't recall from reading the McKinley book that McKinley had that same kind of hold. The Article One was a lot. The Congress perceived their role and their responsibility and their relative power in a very different way vis-a-vis McKinley, who had to charm them, as opposed to the current Republicans who are pretty scared of the White House.
Yeah. Well, first of all, yes, you got it absolutely right. The presidential power in that period, this is before Wilson, this is before FDR, this is before Lyndon Johnson. McKinley was capable of moving the Congress, but it was because of the many good personal relationships he had with it, and because he was a persuasive individual. But yeah, he didn't bludge them into this would have been anathema to him. And I would say this: there's a piece that's going to be in the Journal tomorrow. I've had a chance to read it. It's really good. I think well informed, well written, deeply researched. Obviously, I think I've done a hell of a job with it myself. But in that piece, my point is that there is a limit to having a mob of MAGA influencers descend on Congress. It's one thing to do it in confirmation, where it's like you must support our leader in doing this, even if you don't want to. It gets far more complex when you're dealing with, for example, the five big economic issues that are coming that Congress is going to have to deal with. Raise the debt ceiling, fund the government, pass budget resolutions, pass reconciliation. All of these things are, it's going to be much harder, in part because President Trump doesn't have necessarily a viewpoint on should there be one reconciliation bill or two. And so my view is that that this tool of unleashing the guy who popularized Pizzagate, for example, that may be one thing when you're trying to beat somebody into submission to voting for RFK. I think it's an entirely different thing though when you get around to even the influencer's message is not as clear. If it is, here's why you need to be for one reconciliation bill or for two reconciliation bills, and that's where we're getting. So, I think the president's got to be careful about it. And I say that explicitly. He cannot use vinegar. He has to use honey in this next step where he has to help lead the Congress to the resolution of these five big economic things that they're coming at us. March 14th is when we run out of money, so we got to fund the government. By April 15th, they're supposed to have the framework in place for the FY26 budget. It's time's a wasting and some big challenges here, and it's going to have an impact on the markets, and it's going to have an impact on public policy. He's at his high point in the CBS poll in personal approval. 53% approve of the job that he's doing. That's the highest he's ever had. And more important for him, he has good numbers on things like, doing what he said he would do in the campaign and being energetic and being focused. Those numbers in the high 50s, 60s, and even 70%. But 2/3 of the American people do not think he has done enough, that he's not focused enough on the issue that led many of them to vote for him, which is inflation, specifically in the economy generally. And we're about ready to have a bunch of decisions made that are going to affect those numbers.
I'll agree with you, and it will be interesting to see the kind of the MAGA ecosystem as it's a very powerful tool and a weapon, but whether it's purpose built and well designed for his next round of needs or not. Members don't like being threatened with primaries, but they get in line a lot of the time, and we'll see if that's a well he can keep going back to.
Yeah.
You talked about realignments, and I've written some, not nearly as much as you, but I've read a lot. Again, probably not as much as you, about the Gilded Age, which is fascinating. When changes wrought by technology and globalization led to a radical shift in economies, and that was true in the Gilded Age in McKinley. It sure seems true now. It led to a realignment of the parties, and McKinley was able to consolidate it and lead to multiple decades of GOP dominance until the Great Depression, really, because of the Teddy Taft split is what gave it to Wilson. I'm interested in the realignment that happened then, McKinley's role in it, and how that realignment contrasts with what many perceive as a realignment today. We had Patrick Ruffini on, a former guy who worked for you and Ken at the campaign, who talks about the GOP becoming a multiracial working class party, and that's what a lot of the people hope will be the post-Trump GOP. Compare and contrast, please, on the realignments.
Yeah. Well, first of all, remember the Republican Party was the Free Labor Party. It came into existence as the party that was opposed to slave labor. And so we had been a working man's party right from the beginning. And that's one of the original themes of the Lincoln campaign, for example, was that he was a common, ordinary, working American, not not a creature of privilege. And McKinley was in that tradition. McKinley, in fact, was known as a lawyer in defending the rights of workers with regard to pay and working conditions. He defended coal miners and union members and so forth. And protection was identified in many minds as a pro-worker, pro-farmer policy. How are we going to make certain that American farmers and American workers are on a level playing field with slave labor abroad or colonial labor abroad or unfair practices? Where McKinley stood out was partly his own personal background, but the other was that he was enormously open to the changing nature of America. The biggest organization in America back then was the American Protective Association, which was not geared towards the tariff. It was anti-immigrant, and they had chapters in all of the states and most communities. And their endorsement was literally the difference in battleground states between people losing or winning races for the governorship, for example. And McKinley, in his bid for a second term as governor, is opposed by the APA. And the reason is that he had shown undue support, in their mind, for Catholic prison guards in Ohio, who were primarily, Irish or Italian. And so they opposed him. In fact, in 1895, they announced that all the candidates running for president, that they will, all the Republican candidates are acceptable except one, McKinley. And they go after McKinley in the early contest in 1896, saying that he's a member of a secret Catholic society. And he takes him on, his campaign takes him on by saying, how could a guy who is on the board of deacons of the First Methodist Church of Canton, Ohio, be a member of a secret Catholic society? But he is, they admit, a member of secret societies. He's a member of the Grand Army of the Republic of Union veterans. He was a member of his college fraternity, for God's sake. And they mock them. And when it comes time for the Republican convention, they have their revenge, because the first person to pronounce a prayer at the beginning of the first session of the St. Louis convention is a rabbi. And a black preacher gives the benediction at one of the sessions. And this is like, you always had the Presbyterian or the Methodist or the Baptist preacher, and here's the McKinley people mocking the APA by having these foreigners. And one of the amazing things about the 1896 campaign, in which 750,000 people descend upon Canton, Ohio, is that a great many of them are people who would never seen at a Republican campaign event before. Portuguese sponge fishermen from Rhode Island, and Italian glassers from New York, and Irish coal miners, and German mechanics, and all of these ethnic groups, many of them Catholic, not many of them Anglo-Saxon white Protestant, are celebrating their candidate, and this helped realign the politics. He's also the first candidate in either party to openly appear with black voters and ask for their support. He invites all of the black Republican leaders in the South to visit with him in Thomasville, Georgia, in March of 1895. And literally, these were people who the rest of the Republican Party didn't deal with until the time of the convention. And at the convention, you basically paid their hotel bills, put money in their pocket, and promised you'd make them the postmaster in their town if you'd support their nominee for the nomination. And instead, McKinley's treating them as equals. And when they say to him at the end of his supposed month-long, quote, vacation in the South at the home of Mark Hanna, when they ask him to come on his way back to Washington and stop in Jacksonville, Florida, and speak to a gathering of black Republicans, he agrees, and then goes on to Savannah, Georgia, and appears in a black church that's presided over by the president of the Colored Youth University, the University for Colored Youth in Georgia, who's a black Republican leader. And this is the first time a presidential candidate has ever done this. In fact, as president, he appointed so many black Republicans to positions as port collectors and blah, blah this and blah, blah that, that when he is killed, one of the criticisms of Theodore Roosevelt is he is not as generous in his black patronage as his predecessor, William McKinley, was. He is so open to this changing nature of American society that on October 12th, he is endorsed by Bishop Ireland, the Bishop of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and it is the first time that a Republican presidential candidate has been endorsed by a member of the Catholic hierarchy. And this is the spirit of McKinley, which is we're all in this together. One of the most incredible events in the campaign happens on October 9th when 2,000 veterans dressed in butternut gray get off of the trains in Canton, Ohio, and form up members of the Confederate Army in the Shenandoah Valley. These are the people who are trying to kill McKinley. They were the men who tried when he launched himself on a suicide mission at Antietam and lived. When at Cedar Creek he was thought to be a certain a casualty of the battle. These are the men trying to kill him, and he has invited them to come to Canton, Ohio, and it is the country's never seen it. Literally tens of thousands of people line the streets in this little town in northwest or northeast Ohio to watch blue and gray Confederate veterans and Union veterans form up in front of the Stark County Courthouse. Each one of them is wearing a badge, half blue and half gray, with a quote on it from George Washington. Quote is, "There should be no north, nor south, nor east, nor west, but a common country." And they march up Market Street with flags flying and bands playing, and they stand in front of his home, and the major, as he liked to call, he preferred to be called the major. He said, "I don't know about governor, congressman, president. I know I earned that one," and he did earn it. And they show up on his front steps, and he says, "Patriotism is not bound by state or class or sectional lines. We are a reunited country. We have but one flag. Sectionalism was surrendered at Appomattox. My campaign stands for country first, country last, and country with stainless honor. And if we are ever forced to fight again, and God forbid that we shall fight as brothers under a common flag." And the nation has not seen this. This is a nation where the memory of the Civil War has polarized the country in ways that are impossible for us to comprehend today. And here's a decorated Union war veteran, a true hero, and he is welcoming his brethren from the South to say, "We're in this all together." And it was a moment the country just was astonished to see. And every one of the men had a blue and a gray badge, and I have two of them.
Oh, wow. Very cool.
Yeah.
You open with Teddy Roosevelt, and it's funny. I used to think that Trump was more Teddy Roosevelt, a brash New Yorker who loves the media, eager to shake everything up, would like to be on Mount Rushmore. Was Teddy Roosevelt the inheritor of the McKinley program, or did he take things in a more progressive direction, fitting with what either he believed or where he wanted to go?
The answer is yes. Um, so McKinley, without McKinley making him Assistant Secretary of the Navy, we would never heard from him again. He sends the famous. His boss is recuperating on a vacation in Maine. He sends the famous telegram. TR sends the famous telegram to Dewey: make coal. Load coal, make steam. If hostilities are declared and the Spanish fleet attempts to leave Manila, destroy them. He can't resign in a blaze of glory and organize the Rough Riders. He can't go up Kettle Hill. He can't go up San Juan Hill. He can't become a war hero. He cannot be mustered out in September of 1898 from the army and be elected governor of the most critical battleground state in the Union, New York, 6 weeks later. None of this is possible without McKinley picking him. But yes, first of all, remember McKinley is enormously popular. We don't know that from the progressive historians who wrote about this era, because he was too staid and normal, and he was not the exuberant personality that TR was. But when he is shot in September of 1901 in Buffalo, 500,000 people line the railroad tracks from Buffalo to Washington, D.C. There are like an estimated 30,000 people who jam the station in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, when the train stops to water and take on fuel. The governor of Pennsylvania cannot push his way through the crowd to pay his respects to Mrs. McKinley. because it's so large. And when the train begins to pull out of the station, 30,000 people spontaneously break into singing patriotic songs. When he arrives at the Baltimore station, literally the tracks for the last couple of hundred yards into the station, people have thrown flowers, bouquets on the railroad tracks. So when the train comes in, a reporter says the entire locomotive was covered with flowers. And when they make the final run into Washington D.C. To have his body lay in state in the west, in the East Room, and then in the Capitol, reporters say looked out into the growing darkness, and the railroad tracks from Baltimore to Washington are lined with fires. People have started bonfires, and most of them are poor black farmers. And when he's taken to the Wirt receiving vault in Canton, Ohio, to be held, his body to be held there until they can build a mausoleum, thousands of Union war veterans tromp into the Canton cemetery along a path that has been covered in sweet pea flowers. The school children of Nashville, Tennessee, have contributed nickels and dimes and bought a trainload of sweet pea flowers to be sent to his funeral site. And grizzled Union veterans are stooping down and putting these flowers in their lapels. The entire cabinet is there, openly weeping, and standing apart from them is a young vice president who does not sit with them for fear that his emotions will overcome him. And shortly thereafter, young Theodore Roosevelt announces that in order to make the country feel at home and comfort, that he will continue. He pledges to continue the policies of William McKinley, and he does. But he grows them. McKinley was willing to take on the trust. McKinley was willing to. He was worried about the growing concentration of power. A lot of what Roosevelt did found its roots in the 4.5 years of McKinley's first term and second, and beginning of the second term. But the progressive historians loved the personality of Roosevelt, and McKinley was bland by comparison, and which is why Lewis Gould was right. History gets him wrong because history paid attention to the personality and not to the man himself.
Go maybe 3 more minutes here. By the way, I like cabinets that don't weep. It's like people who weren't captured. Um, McKinley in the business community. On the one hand, he got along with J.P. Morgan, and the business leaders of his day seemed to connect well with him. And on the other hand, you're right, he was a trust buster, which couldn't have been all that appreciated by Rockefeller. What would McKinley have thought about Elon Musk, and how do you see him and the business leaders compared to Trump and today's business leaders?
Yeah, I haven't done enough work in the economic side, the trust busting side of it, but my sense is from reading of it, is that McKinley was concerned not with just size itself, but the use of size. For example, my suspicion is he looked at Standard Oil and said, you know what, these people are driving down the cost for the ordinary family. One of the things that Rockefeller was successful at was buying companies and making them far more efficient and continually driving down the cost of the end product. So I'm not certain that he was all that worried about that. I think what he was worried about was privilege that was used for the advantage of a specific company or industry. Um, so, but yeah, and his good friend was John Sherman, the Sherman Antitrust Act. So he was sensitive to this, but. But yeah, he in a way he had it easier because they were grateful to him for having settled the currency question, both by winning the election of 1896 and then signing the Gold Act of 1900. So the business community knew that we would be attractive for foreign investment, which was a big concern for them. We simply didn't have the money to open the mines and build the factories and open the farmland and expand the cities and so forth. We had to borrow that money from abroad, and in order to do that, we had to have an attractive currency, not a silver currency and not a greenback currency. And McKinley, though he had wavered on the issue early on, had come to again believe that we had to have a currency that was as good as the rest of the world.
Very last question, because you're a campaign guy, I have it on good authority. McKinley kind of invented micro targeting. in terms of, it was pamphlets. It wasn't quite digital, but give us a minute here on the innovations of the 1896 election, Hanna and McKinley.
Yeah. First of all, it ain't Hannah. In fact, that's one of the things that my book proved to the small group of McKinley historians. This was there are 111 days between the time of the Republican convention and the election, and Hannah is on the road for over 70 of them trying to raise money. The campaign is actually run by a 32-year-old punk, a young lawyer born in Cincinnati, went to law school in Cincinnati, lit out for the West to make his living, moved to Lincoln, Nebraska, where he officed in a small office building where one of the other offices was occupied by the owner of the building, William Jennings Bryan. And the two men often had lunch with a third compatriot, the ROTC commander at the University of Nebraska, who was incredibly bored that he was stuck in such a backwater, a guy named John J. Pershing. And they used to have lunch at a 25-cent diner. And this kid, and he is a kid, tells McKinley in 1894, if you run for president, I'll help you organize Nebraska, and I want you to be president because you're my kind of guy. And when McKinley shows up in Lincoln, Nebraska in the fall of 1894, he finds out that everybody in the state has been lined up by the now 30-year-old kid. And the kid says to him, I've got Nebraska wired for you. I'm working on the Dakotas and Wyoming. But I'm leaving Nebraska because I bought a gas utility in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and I'm moving to Chicago. I'm going to make it big. This is when gas utilities literally were several blocks. And so this kid goes into Chicago, gets the banks to back him, and goes and buys neighborhood gas utilities, knits them together, gets economies of scale, lowers the prices to the consumer, and starts to make a lot of money. And as a new guy in Illinois, which is the centerpiece of the primary contest for the Republican nomination, McKinley says, you're in charge of my campaign in Illinois. He's now 31 years old and takes command of the campaign. And the opposition is led by the blonde boss, 32-year-old Congressman William J. Larimer, who has control of 20,000 patronage jobs in the Cook County Republican machine. And Charles G. Dawes takes him on. And at the convention in Springfield in April of 1896, he decisively beats the machine by better than 2-1, and effectively ends the contest for the Republican nomination. And that night, McKinley sits down at his home in Canton and writes him a letter saying, "Thank you. You long again won my heart." He is the son that William McKinley never has, and he becomes the campaign manager at the age of 32 and sits his ass in a chair in Chicago and runs this gigantic machine. And he's the author of Micro-Targeting. I'm trying to collect copies of all of the pieces of literature, which literally left the headquarters in train car loads being dispatched to states. And the memos that he writes to McKinley and Hanna on the progress of the campaign show an incredibly detailed mind. McKinley wins, and Charles Dawes becomes the director. He becomes the comptroller of the currency in charge of the nation's banking system, and he's 32 years old. He goes on to become vice president of the United States under Calvin Coolidge, first head of the Bureau of the Budget under Warren G. Harding, ambassador to Great Britain, first head of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in the Great Depression, second American to win the Nobel Peace Prize, a respected businessman in Chicago who goes belly up in the Great Depression and spends the rest of his life in business till he turns 80 some odd years old, making money and paying off every single debt he incurred in the Depression with interest before dying. He's one of the most remarkable men I've run across in American politics, and he is the kid running the campaign, and he's micro-targeting.
Karl Rove, I know your next book. You got to write about Dawes if nobody has written a great book. But for now, thanks for appearing with all of us. That was a fascinating, fun talk. You obviously are passionate about it. We got a whole lot of copies that we'll send around, the link for people to get mailed to them that we got because I was excited about the book, and now everybody's excited about the book. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and I've seen a lot of people on this. Ross Ramsey is on here. Michael Maybach is on here. You got my Christmas card list is on here.
Very good. Thank you, Karl.
Thank you. Appreciate it.